when people are using credit cards, you're trusting Visa, MasterCard, American Express, you're trusting that secure element in the chip. That stuff's not open source. You're trusting things. So I think as a community, we can't just be black or white or binary and say open source good, closed source bad. I think it comes down to, well, who is providing that closed source software? And do I trust that organization? And have they, again, gone through these third-party assessments to provide that level of trust?
Don't worry, we are friends.
And we are back. Welcome back to the FRENS VALIDATOR YouTube channel. If you're new on this channel, then please go ahead and subscribe if you want to stay on top of everything that is happening in the staking industry and on all the proof of stake blockchains. My name is Juri Halborn and I'm the host of the show. And today I have the pleasure to welcome David Schwed from Halborn to the show. Once again, David, how are you doing? Pleasure to have you on again.
I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, and the pleasure is mine. And today we will talk about open source versus closed source. We will also touch base on the Ledger news that broke a couple of weeks ago. But before we do that, could you briefly get us on one page in regards to your person? So who are you? What are you doing at Halborn? And what is Halborn doing? Just like a quick intro so that we are all set.
Sure. So my name is David Schwed. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Halborn. Halborn is a cybersecurity company focusing on the convergence of Web 2 and Web 3. A little bit about myself. Prior to joining Halborn, I was the global head of digital assets technology for BNY Mellon. And prior to that, I was the chief security officer for Galaxy Digital. And prior to that, I spent a number of years at my own telecommunications company. And then prior to that, a number of years in just various TradFi organizations working in technology, risk management, internal audit, and information security roles.
Yeah, interesting. And now you are at Halborn, and Halborn is making sure that the industry is secure, so to say. So crypto projects can go to Halborn and ask for auditing the code and making sure that there are no bugs in the code and that the products that people use in crypto are secure. And with that in mind, let's switch to the debate that we have planned for today. It is about open source versus closed source. But before we transfer the whole discussion to the crypto side of things, I would be super interested because you mentioned that you are in the industry for quite some time now, but I want to really zoom out and ask the question, when did this discussion first come up about open source and closed source? So for example, how was the internet in the first place? Was it more open source or was it more closed source in the beginning? So maybe you have some prominent exemplary debates in mind.
Sure. I mean, it's always, especially, coming from TradFi or coming from enterprise environments, there's always been this debate of, what is better, right? Open source or closed source. And if you look at, say, Microsoft is closed source. They're not open. They're not providing their source code, for a variety of reasons. But then we started to see a shift, as we went from Unix to Linux, where, well, let's start open sourcing this. And it wasn't necessarily for security reasons. It was more for let's open source this for the community, because if we crowdsource and we allow the community to provide updates to it, we're going to have, faster development. We're going to have more development. We're going to have, community feedback, excitement about a project. So that was really more of the genesis of why we're open sourcing certain software, was to give back to the community and allow the community to start, providing their own developments, updates, projects. Let's fork this Linux distro and create this Linux distro. So we saw a number of great advancements in different technologies just from the sake of open sourcing it and giving it to the community for them to do their own development.
Yeah, and I think this was also one of the reasons why we have seen such an exponential growth in that regards, because people were just able to get started because everything was so accessible. And I think we have the same discussion in the crypto industry, right? So also the big blockchains are mostly completely open source, so people can start building. And this is why also DeFi took off so quickly, because we have seen so many projects, and this is also a reason why more TVL came into place, more users were interested in using these products. But I think that's very interesting, and also you see bugs much quicker because you have more eyeballs on the code. But on the other hand, what we have discussed in our previous interview, you have a huge potential attack surface, because if everything is open source, everything is visible. Also, attackers can eventually see some gaps or some opportunities to step in and manipulate things. So yeah, what is your thought on this trade-off in terms of open source?
So it's a good question, and there's really two distinct risks that I want to talk about. So the first one is the one that you mentioned, where the code is open source, so the attackers can actually go line by line, looking at the source code and looking for vulnerabilities. And in some respects, some will argue that that is a bug bounty program. In some respects, that once you open source the code, and you're going to have the threat actors and the malicious actors look at the code and try to find vulnerabilities, they're in fact crowdsourcing a bug bounty program in some respect. Unfortunately, at the detriment to some people that maybe, will lose some funds. I don't necessarily have an opinion one way or the other on it, because in some respects it's keeping the security, I guess, at a heightened level, because now we are crowdsourcing these bug bounties, and in some respect you shouldn't have security through obscurity. So, just saying that something is protected because I don't have access to the source code isn't necessarily hiding a vulnerability. You're just delaying for it to be discovered. So by having everything open source, in some respects, you are accelerating the discovery of vulnerabilities. I think the bigger issue to talk about is the fact that a lot of projects, like you said, are forked from another project. So you have, your Uniswaps, and then you have all your child swaps that were forked over the Uniswap. The problem comes into play is if there's a vulnerability that's discovered at that main, project, and it's not necessarily discovered by the person who forked that code, and they're not have a great vulnerability assessment or vulnerability management program, an attacker can simply look at what was the main project that was forked from, see that a vulnerability was patched, and then look for all the forked codes in GitHub and say, let me take that vulnerability that was patched at this project and just see that it's not patched at all these child projects. And we saw that somewhat in a vulnerability, a zero-day vulnerability that Halborn discovered. There was a vulnerability at the Bitcoin level that was forked at a certain level, and we saw, I think, something like 200 and some odd chains that had this particular vulnerability. Now, we worked with all the major chains in order to ethically disclose this and allow them to patch it before we alerted the community. But there's going to be those chains that were forked over Bitcoin that didn't necessarily go and patch this. So now if I'm a malicious actor and I see all of these Bitcoin forks as of a certain date have this vulnerability, I'll just run a scan and look for vulnerable code. So in some cases, we're kind of telegraphing to the community, hey, here's a vulnerability, and then here's how to exploit it, and now go find code that didn't go and patch it. So we are kind of playing cat and mouse, or whack-a-mole in that case, with those types of situations. But it's also very similar to the Web 2 world, where you can just go to CVE, look at a vulnerability. For example, let's take a Cisco router, traditional Web 2 telecommunications. So here's a Cisco router, here's a CVE, here's a vulnerability, and then it's patched as of this date. Again, an attacker will just run a scan and look for Cisco routers that were not upgraded, that are running an older version or firmware. So it's really the same thing that we're seeing in the Web 2 world. I think it's just heightened in the Web 3 world due to the fact that everything is now open source, and you can just scan very quickly and look for those vulnerable code chains.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, and I really want to dive deeper into the fork side of things, because I think this is a very, very important discussion here, because after Uniswap emerged, a lot of Uniswap copycats came out of nowhere on all various kinds of chains. And I think this is also kind of one of the disadvantages for founders in the open source world, that they can get copied, which is also why Uniswap v3 was also partially legally protected. But yeah, my question here is pretty straightforward for you is, do you also criticize this blindly copy pasting of code from a security point of view, that people just, copy an AMM and deploy it on another blockchain without having a clue?
100%. I mean, it makes, especially now with a ChatGPT, I could just say, ChatGPT, write me the instructions to, clone a repo and deploy a project. Now, again, if you're just simply copying and repeating and not adding anything to that project, or adding any sort of, features or benefits or anything to the community, to me, that's simply a cash grab. If I'm just going to fork Uniswap and just call it David Swap and add no additional features to it, to me, that it's not necessarily something that is going to be given back to the community. Now, if I wanted to fork it and add additional features or add additional layers of controls, or maybe provide integration into other projects, then arguably that's the whole point of open source, is to make things better. And then Uniswap can see a fork and maybe borrow some of those features, and that's really how the community kind of elevates itself. However, I think part of the blame or part of the responsibility should also go back on the users. If I'm a regular user of Uniswap and now I see David Swap pop up and David Swap is now offering lower transaction fees, and I just want to quickly go over to that, part of the blame is on me as well as someone in the community. Stop chasing, and I've said this repeatedly, stop chasing yield or stop chasing lower transaction fees. There's something there, and there's a reason why. So in the case of one project versus another project, again, do your due diligence, look on LinkedIn, look on GitHub, see how many developers are actually contributing to the code. When was the last commit? There's certain things you can do to protect yourself and not just look at the new shiny project that just popped up. So, as long as the community is still using all of these clones that don't provide any additive features or benefits or values, they're going to keep popping up.
Yeah, I totally agree on this. And one question that just came into my mind when you said these copycats that don't really change something. We have seen a lot of bridge exploits in 2022 and also 2021. Out of pure interest, are there also a lot of bridge forks in the space, or is this mostly something that comes from the EVM world with AMMs and so?
No, I mean, there's definitely some that goes to that. There's, and again, this isn't a unique issue for Web3. Again, it's just heightened, but there's a lot of borrowing of code, right? I always make fun of developers that, most of them are just copying and pasting from Stack Overflow. It's the same thing in Web3 as well. If somebody wrote code and it's in production, let me just go into the GitHub repo and let me just grab that function and let me just grab this. And a lot of code, isn't necessarily sloppy, but it could be a lot of, borrowed from here, borrowed from here, borrowed from here. And the problem is if you don't have a fully fleshed out, QA process and, code scanning and, working with third-party assessors like a Halborn or one of our competitors, that's when these things are not getting caught. So I think it's a combination of, I don't want to say, an immature software development process, but in some respects it is. It's that coupled with a lack of this QA, UAT development, testing process, lack of operational security, lack of, internal scanning. And so it's just a combination of all these things are leading to some of these exploits. So I don't necessarily think it's one particular issue. I think it's unfortunately, just a systemic problem that we're seeing in Web3.
I see. Yeah. Also makes a lot of sense here. And now let's try to talk about this question from another perspective, from another angle, which is like keeping everything closed source. So we see one or two crypto projects also from the DeFi side of things that keep their code closed source, and then immediately a lot of community members say that this is very intransparent. They argue that there might be a scam behind all of this. So what are your thoughts on like closed sourcing in terms of trust, that people don't necessarily trust closed source project because they can't really estimate what's behind the code?
So, I have two thoughts. So first, I'll talk generally and then I'll talk about Web3. The people that say that, the first question I would ask them is, are you reviewing the code? And the answer is going to be no. 99.9% of the time, just because something is open source doesn't mean it's safe. And it also doesn't mean that somebody's actually reviewing it. We can't rely on people just to, for their own benefit, that somebody else is just sitting down and looking through line by line code. Audits are very, very expensive, or assessments are very, very expensive. So just the thought that because code is publicly available, that somebody's going to take, 30, 40, 50, 60 hours out of their day just to review every time there's a code, and make sure there's a vulnerability. So the first question I would ask them is, if you're using open source code because you feel it's safer, are you yourself reviewing that code? And the answer is going to be no. The second question is, are you actually compiling that code yourself? The answer is going to be no. So I think there's this misconception that if something's open source, that somebody else is doing all this work for you to validate that there's no vulnerabilities or issues. And that's just a falsity that I think is just kind of perpetuating this open source is better than closed source. Now, on the flip side, when you get into Web3, I understand the need for more transparency because, again, not your keys, not your crypto, transactions are immutable, and there could be supply chain, risks or attacks. So I think, there is this middle ground of trust. It exists in the Web2 world, and it even exists in some respects in Web3. I would ask everybody to, take a step back. Okay, well, you're trusting somebody at some point. You're trusting telecommunications carriers, you're trusting routers, you're trusting a cloud provider that's hosting this code someplace. There's some level of trust that you are taking in some entity at some place when you're making your transaction. You're trusting Like I said, most of this equipment is sitting, either in bare metal in a colo site, or it's sitting in an AWS or GCP or Azure or Oracle or whatever cloud provider. There is some level of trust somewhere. So I think as a community, there has to be some rallying around, some tried and true organizations. And there are some ways to gain that trust, whether you're looking at things like SOC 2s or ISO certifications, or you're looking at third-party assessments. Perfect example is, and we'll get into it in a little bit, is, Ledger. Everybody was up in arms over Ledger. Well, why? Because people trusted Ledger. Like, that's really what it comes down to. They developed this trust, and people trusted them, and then they lost the trust. And that, I think, is, some of the issue. When people are using credit cards, you're trusting Visa, MasterCard, American Express, you're trusting that secure element in the chip. That stuff's not open source. You're trusting things. So I think as a community, we can't just be black or white or binary and say open source good, closed source bad. I think it comes down to, well, who is providing that closed source software, and do I trust that organization? And have they, again, gone through these third-party assessments to provide that level of trust?
Yeah, you pointed out more or less a branding problem, I would say, here as well. So that I associate security with a brand. So the typical credit card providers that did in that sense a very, very good job over the past couple of years in establishing themselves in the industry as a reliable partner. But let's talk about this branding aspect. I think like what you just said is that if you keep your code closed source, it's not necessarily a problem in terms of security, but eventually it's like a branding problem that some people like blindly jump on the fence and say, okay, this is insecure because it's closed source. But what are some other typical problems that closed source projects run into?
So again, so closed source, and I just wanted to make one more point on that, and I'll touch on that. I think people need to realize, hey, I use my iPhone, and everyone's like, oh, there's a secure, the secure enclave. That's all of that is closed source. Like, there is some level of trust that we are placing in some of the devices that we're using for our cryptographic transactions. Like, everyone is so enamored by the iPhone secure enclave, and it's not open source. Apple's not giving you the code that they're using. When you use HSMs and from Thales, those things are all closed source. So I think, again, this, like, you're right, it comes down to branding and reputation. But going back to the closed source, I think the disadvantage to closed source is that crowdsourcing from a bug bounty perspective. Now, they do have bug bounty programs, so like a Microsoft or whoever is going to have, arguably better bug bounty programs because the payout is much larger. I think that's an issue that we have in Web3 today is, we're just assuming that for the sake and for the good of the community, that people are just going to be, performing these, assessments for free. And the bug bounty programs in Web3 nowhere equal the total amounts that you can get on the Web2, which means the really good hackers are going to be focusing on the bug bounties in Web2, the ethical ones. Now, the bad hackers are going to be focusing on the exploits in Web3 just because the potential yields and payouts. So they're not going to be incentivized to ethically disclose some of these things. So, but that's the piece on that. But when we get into like the closed source systems, all we're doing is removing some of the, I guess, data that's available to a malicious hacker. So they don't necessarily have the source code to look through to find vulnerabilities, but they can still look for and find vulnerabilities. So, making something closed system really is just removing maybe one or two steps, that a malicious hacker would look at, whether they're trying to decompile, compiled code, or whether they're running their tools to look for vulnerabilities within the code. So making something closed source is really just, kind of creating the barrier for, the threat actors to look at the code, that much higher, because they can't just look at the code and just, spot a vulnerability. They actually have to run tools and, run different types of, techniques to find those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Let's dive a little bit deeper into here. So would you say also that there's like kind of an incentive problem here, that people are more incentivized of taking advantage of bugs in the code rather than pointing them out and fixing them?
100%. I mean, just take, I'm not going to go through the numbers of the bug bounty that, Halborn received, but let's just say it was, maybe enough to take a quick plane ride, to Florida from New York. Like, it really wasn't anything that was significant. And the vulnerability that we found affected 280, like I said, Bitcoin forks, including, Zcash and including like Litecoin. And, you can find the details online. And if you look at the particular vulnerability, it had the ability to, affect whether it was denial of service or whether it was more of an orchestrated attack to, take a 51% attack. It was a potential material substantial, like it was a really big deal. And there was no incentive in order for someone who discovered this to turn it over and say, oh, here's a $500,000 bounty or here's $1 million bounty. So if another organization or somebody who is, a malicious person could say, well, listen, I have this vulnerability now. I could do one of three things. I could either ethically disclose it because I'm a good person. Well, this just took me, I don't know, 40 to 60 hours to discover it. So what's my incentive now? I'm not getting paid for this. Option number two is, well, now maybe I should exploit this and, maybe steal some money from it because I have no incentive to turn this over. Or option three, which is even scarier, is some people are selling these to the black market. So they'll say, hey, here's a 0-day vulnerability. I personally don't want to exploit it because I feel like I would be a bad person. But there's this middle ground gray area of, hey, I'm just going to sell that exploit to somebody else, get some funds. And if they want to do something bad with it, let them do something bad with it. So, we're seeing that more and more where people are discovering vulnerabilities, not getting incentivized to disclose it and just selling them, to the black market for other people to now exploit it. So I think as a community, we have to provide that incentive for that ethical disclosure. Otherwise, there really is no benefit to providing the open source software if you're not going to incentivize people to actually review and assess the code and look for these vulnerabilities and ethically disclose it. Otherwise, we're creating, again, a falsity that there's people looking at this code.
Yeah, I think this is like very scary if you portray it like this also, because for me, if I would say I would find a huge bug in, I don't know, the Uniswap code. So my biggest incentive would be to not exploit it for one reason, and that's a legal one. So chain analysis, you have to be very, very smart to actually run away with the funds because the authorities can trace you down. But if you have apparently the ability to, I don't know, make a revenue cut with the real hacker who really exploits the code at the end of the day, then things are getting more interesting. So how extensive is this sector or niche in the black market where you see that information about crypto bugs are being shared and sold? Is this like a very common thing, or would love to know more about this.
Common. And I think I want to, just for the audience, create an analogy, and I'll answer your question, because I think it's easier to think about it in this sense. You're walking down the street and you see an armored car and you see the doors completely open. Now you can think to yourself, I could just very easily go and grab that cash and just walk away with it. Or I could go inside and I can tell that person, hey, the door, to your truck, you left it open and there's, bags of cash that are sitting there because you're refilling an ATM. That's the two options. Now, the second one the first one to your point is, I would feel bad about going and grabbing that cash and walking away because now I'm holding stolen funds and I just created something illegal. But there's something in your mind that says, well, it's not a bad thing if I maybe tell somebody else that this door is open and then they go and grab the cash. And then a few weeks later, I just get, here's $1 million that's wired to my bank account. I feel like maybe I didn't do anything that was bad or illegal because I wasn't the one who actually took the money. I just told somebody else. So this is how people are justifying this in their mind. That I'm not the one, actually conducting the illegal act. I'm just telling somebody else, hey, look, there's a vulnerability over here, and then I'm going to get paid for just pointing that out. So there is this black market, and it is an issue, and it's not just a Web3 issue; it's a Web2 issue as well, because there are organizations that buy, there are nation states that buy and incentivize, 0-day exploits. And that's what we see, like if we go back to like the Ronin hack, the 0-day vulnerability with an Acrobat. There are nation states, there are malicious organizations, not necessarily state sponsored, but operate, under the, I guess the approval of rogue nation states, or there's just large criminal organizations that will go to the black market. They will buy these 0-day vulnerabilities, and they will either use them as a stepping stone for a larger attack, or they will wait for an opportunity to now exploit one of these vulnerabilities. So there's absolutely a huge market right now for, looking for these 0-day vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's I didn't know that it was like that extreme, that also governments or nation states are in this game as well. So so you would basically say that we have a problem that some people are incentivized to point out the bugs to the wrong people, or like sell this information to the wrong people, or like the person that gives you most of the money, which is usually not the project itself, but some outsiders that want to exploit it.
Absolutely. Listen, I'm not saying myself or anybody that I know, but everybody at some point in their mind, there's a price in which they can be tempted to go rogue and go bad. If, like I said, if we go with that armored truck, analogy, you may not be the one that to grab it, but if somebody turned around and said, I'll give you $25 million if you ever call me and tell me that there's a truck that's open, that's a lot of money, and you're going to think about that. Now, if your reward for going inside and telling them that they left the door open is $500, and you're like $500 versus $25 million, I mean, that's really what we're seeing, as far as the bug bounty incentives, for some of these, ethical, white hat hackers that could very easily turn gray, could very easily turn black. I mean, look at look at the Ronin attack, $622 million versus, I don't know, they probably didn't even have a bug bounty program if somebody was talking about some of the vulnerabilities that were being discovered in that case.
Yeah. I think this analogy between the 25 million versus the $500, I think like really shows how extreme the situation here is. But yeah, like going back to the closed source versus open source discussion, would you say that there are like projects where you would insist or like highly recommend to keep the code closed source? Like, is this something where you would say, if this is open source, then what are you doing?
Yeah, and I think it's not necessarily the open versus closed. I think it's the centralization of the development versus the community development that I think is really more of the interesting perspective on it. For example, looking at, say, an operating system, right? Like, there's good or bad. You may hate or love Microsoft. Microsoft is a huge organization that probably spends, their budget on security probably trumps, most of the Web3 budgets, across every single company. So the question is, if I am a large enterprise organization and I need an operating system for, my users, am I going to go with an operating system that's controlled by Microsoft, or am I going to go with a Linux where it's just open source to the community? And there's going to be this, I'm not looking necessarily at the open source versus closed source side of the debate, because, an organization like a bank is not necessarily going to start, pouring through, Linux kernel code and actually look for vulnerabilities. There's going to be this I trust type of mentality. And then the question is, do I trust the community? Do I trust the bug bounty programs? Do I trust, all of this? Or do I trust Microsoft's process? Do I trust Microsoft's secure development process? Do I trust Microsoft's assessment process? And the answer is going to be not necessarily open or closed source. It's more about, ownership of that code, centralization, and, just trust in general. So I think that's probably when we start talking about enterprise, the open closed source is more about centralization versus, community driven development, I think is probably, where my head goes when I think about certain things.
I see. So generally, so they are like, the question is more about, okay, what do you like really want to do here? Like if the community should really be involved here, then for sure you would advise, okay, let's keep it open source. Whereas when you want to have it like the Microsoft style of thing, where you have like a company, it makes more sense to keep it closed source. But yeah, like back to my question that I've had in the beginning in regards to token bridges. So for me, it somehow feels on the one hand pretty like good to know, okay, say a bridge is open source because you have a lot of eyeballs on it. So eventually a bug gets spotted more quickly. On the other hand, I also feel uncomfortable with having a bridge where so many eyeballs are on, because a bug can be easily be found, and then you have again the scenario where this information can be sold on the black market. So what is the situation precisely with token bridges or like crypto bridges in general? Are most of them closed source or open sourced?
Hey, most of them are open because, again, it's Web3. And I think, in this particular use case, I would agree with you that open source is better because, and again, it also comes down to trust and reputation. If this is a new project that pumped up and this is a new bridge that no one's ever seen before, that thing better be open source, because I don't know if this is a rug pull or, what's going on with this that was released. However, again, not to pick on one particular project or another, but, I don't know, like, let's just say, a very reputable exchange, like let's say Coinbase decided to release their own bridge, but they were going to say this is closed. I think some people are just going to say, listen, it's Coinbase. I trust it. They've been around since X. They're regulated. Forget everything that's going on today from the SEC. But there's going to be some trust in this centralized body of like, hey, they have, I don't know, their cybersecurity staff is probably 500 to 1,000 people. I'm going to trust that versus, a team of maybe 4 or 5 people. I mean, we have to think about that, right? Like a project of someone developing a bridge might be a project of 4 to 5 developers, not even security people. So the question is, yes, it's open source, but if I'm going to go line by line and look through that code and look for that vulnerabilities and become my own smart contract auditor, I'm still relying on somebody else. So the question is, would I rather rely on the open source community to look for things, or do I rather rely on the cybersecurity staff of a large organization like a Coinbase? Unless you're a smart contract auditor, you're relying on somebody. So the question is, who do you want to rely on? And I'm not saying one is better than the other. For bridges, when you can potentially lose material amount of funds, again, I'm not saying I would choose one versus the other, but if I am going to go with the open source model, you better believe I'm going to look into who's looking at this, who's assessing it. And if it's open source, so there's an assumption that someone's looking at it, that doesn't do anything for me unless I see that there are projects that are independently reviewing and looking at that code. Going back to the Web 2 world, there was TrueCrypt, and now it's called VeraCrypt. This was like an open source, file level or disk level encryption. There were projects where people were actually reviewing that code and providing their assessments, and people in the community would be looking at those reports. It's the same thing here. If something is open source, show me the reports of the good guys that are just on their own looking at this. And if there isn't any, the fact that it's open source does not provide any added value, other than the fact of, well, if there were vulnerabilities, somebody would have done an exploit at this point. And the question is, yes or no? That may be true. Maybe they're waiting, is number one. And two, maybe the exploit hasn't been introduced yet. On the next code update, there's going to be an exploit. So, again, unless there's an assessment in the report, I wouldn't necessarily trust open source inherently more than I would trust closed source, depending on where that review is being done by.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And I think that's also like very important here to once again highlight this, because I feel like that as soon as like the average Anon guy on Reddit hears that something is closed source, he jumps on the fence and points that out and say that there's something in the bush in regards of an exploit or a scam.
Yeah, and that may be true. Again, if it's a new project that just popped up with 4 developers, like the question is like, what would I trust more? Like, I'm not going to ask you this question. What would you trust more? An open source bridge that was just released yesterday by 4 developers whose online presence is profile some sort of JPEG, or would you trust Coinbase closed source bridge that was released and said that they validated and tested it? Which one would you trust? It's 100% right. It's not the open source versus closed source. It's the reputation. Yep.
So would you say that Web3 is taking like a similar development that also Web2 already experienced, that we see like brands establishing itself and show that they are reliable over a couple of years, and this is how trust is being like settled?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're going to talk about Ledger, but it's exactly that. Ledger built up a reputation of a trusted brand, and they were closed source, and people were very, very. I mean, that was the go-to. What hardware wallet do I use? It's Ledger, and Ledger was closed source. And you can talk to anybody who's a cybersecurity professional. They will tell you that the number one brand that they recommended to everybody was Ledger, and it was closed source. So that shows you that closed source can be trusted in Web3 based on reputation of that centralized organization.
Yeah, let's talk about Ledger. I think this is the perfect moment here to move this conversation towards Ledger, because you mentioned it. Ledger is a brand that everyone in crypto is associating with security. So Ledger introduced an optional, I think it was $9.99 per month seed phrase recovery service. So for owners of the Nano X wallet. So the service allows people to recover their seed phrase without worrying about losing their paper seed phrase. So first of all, what are your thoughts on this innovation generally, and how secure is this recovery option? So do you have any insights there? So sure. How is it possible to recover your key again? So yeah, would be cool to get your general thoughts on this.
Yeah, so for 2 seconds, let me just kind of walk through how it works, and then I'll walk through my thoughts. So first off is you have your seed phrase that is in the secure element of the device. And again, this is all not independently audited or verified by me. This is just reading through, explaining how it works. So you have your seed phrase, and through an opt-in on the device, so you have to, according to them, you have to click approve. The secure element, in the secure element, it will take your seed phrase and shard it into 3 encrypted shards. So your seed phrase is broken up into 3 separate chunks, encrypted in the secure element. So it never leaves the secure element, just like your seed phrase. Once it leaves it, it's in this encrypted blob that is then sent to outside parties. Those outside parties will hold your encrypted shards, until you need to recover. So the whole point is I lose my ledger device. Now I buy a brand new ledger device and I want to now recover my seed phrase. I could go on, do identity validation. I show my license. I answer some questions. I prove that I am the same person that did the backup. They will then initiate the recovery. The encrypted blobs will then hit the device. It is then decrypted on the device, and now I have my seed phrase. So there's two issues here that come in from a cybersecurity perspective. The first one is, by design, anything that simulates a HSM, a hardware security module, secure element, should by design not have the ability to extract anything that's in that secure element. So that's mistake number one. Mistake number one was, the trust in the community is that these secure elements by design do not have the ability to have the, to send anything out from the secure element. That's the first piece. The second piece is, now you have these encrypted blobs, but now the question is, well, how do these encrypted blobs get decrypted? Where is that key that decrypts it? And Ledger let everybody know that every single Ledger device has that private key. It's a master private key on every single Ledger device that has the ability, and they have to by design, because if you're going to get that recovery of that package, that the new Ledger device that you just bought has the ability to decrypt it. So that brings into question the subpoenability of your encrypted blobs. So because Ledger has the private key to do the decryption, Ledger is the contracted authority with these backup providers. If Ledger receives a subpoena, they can request the encrypted blobs, and they have the private key to decrypt it. So from a trust perspective, they did two things. One is they created an avenue for governments to be able to get a hold of people's crypto. That's number one. Number two, they didn't tell anybody that they were releasing this new feature, and they didn't really give people the ability to opt out. Now they're saying it's an opt-in on the device, but the problem is that functionality is now built into the device itself. What they should have done was two things: either create a brand new device and say that this device has an additive feature that allows you to back up, because I don't think it's a bad feature, and I'll get into that in a second. They should have had a brand new device, or somebody who purchases it knowing that the secure element has this feature built into it. That's number one. Or at the very least, create two different firmwares and say, do you want to opt into a firmware that has the recovery, or do you want to continue with your existing firmware that does not have this ability? So that's what I think they should have done. Now, as far as the feature itself, I don't hate it. And the reason I say that is, I'm a realist in the sense that, not everybody is me. Not everybody is a cybersecurity professional. Not everybody is very technical to know how to back up their own seeds, protect, safely and securely. So we have to, if we want the proliferation of this new technology, or not new anymore, but if we want the masses to start adopting crypto, we have to make the experience or the security of it, seamless or transparent to the user. And part of the big issue today is, if I lose my seed phrase, I lose access to all of my crypto. And then we're yelling at people, not your keys, not your crypto. Don't put it on a centralized exchange because you're going to lose it, like a Celsius or an FTX. So you have to self-custody it. So now you have all these non-technical people that are like, well, I don't even know what a hardware wallet is. And don't lose these 24 magical words. And if you lose these magical 24 words, your crypto's gone forever. So Ledger's like, okay, well, here's a mechanism that we're going to do the backup for you. You press a button, it goes to you, you show your license. This sounds great for that, section of users, but now they're hearing from all the security people yelling, well, that's a shitty feature, don't use it. And I feel like we're not giving the community, or not, for the masses, the non-technical masses, we're not giving them a better solution than that. So I think the solution in of itself isn't terrible. It's not for me. It's not for most people that I run in, the circles that I run in. But I think for the average person who's holding maybe a few $1,000s worth of crypto, where it doesn't equal a large percentage of their holdings, this is a better option than them trying to back up their seed phrase. I just think the way in which they launched it, the way in which they offered it, and that they should have done a new product line was the better answer for this.
Yeah, I think this is a super interesting and important take here, and I want to dive deep into this because it also matches a little bit with what the Ledger CEO mentioned on a Twitter space when announcing this feature. Also, as you mentioned, there were rumors around Ledger developing this, but it was like more or less hidden what was going on behind the curtain. But yeah, anyway, the Ledger CEO mentioned that a feature like this is necessary in order to reach the next millions and millions of crypto users and bring crypto around the world. So my question here for you is very obvious, because we had like kind of a very similar discussion on our previous interview already, is, do we need to make certain trade-offs in terms of security to really bring crypto to the masses, because people are also just too lazy to learn 24 words in and out and don't want to hide their piece of paper somewhere?
So yes, right. And I'm, as you can tell, I'm a big analogy guy. You're basically telling people to don't trust banks, that we should just take all of our cash out, build our own vaults, hire our own armed guards, hide it, stick the cash in our mattress. Like this is what we're telling people to do in crypto. And people don't know how to build vaults. They're not armed guards, they're not, security guards. Like we have to create the ability for people to trust. And I think we haven't figured out how to do that because of the inherent nature of the immutability of the transaction, that coupled with somewhat of a level of immaturity in a lot of these centralized exchanges or centralized organizations from a security perspective, because where the people are reading about breaches all the time, there's not a trust in the centralized authority. So people are now defaulting back to, well, let me hold it myself. I think the answer is not let's figure out a better way to hold necessarily the crypto ourselves, but let's figure out a better way where the person who knows how to do the security better than I do is holding my keys. And I think that's where we need to gravitate towards in order to really, again, bring on the next set of users into this world. So it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be it needs to be in a way where they're not feeling the security. Because again, if I want to dive into it, I can make an argument that the 24 seed words are actually a less secure option than just randomly generating private keys. Once you have your universe of 24 words, and again, I'm not getting into the math, because I know I'm probably going to get attacked online, but well, if I have the 24 words, it would still take a trillion years. But there's a better option of just completely randomized private keys. Once you have the 24 Cs and you're using that from a deterministic perspective to start creating all of your child keys, yes, it's convenient. Now I only have to back up those 24 words. So now we get into this security versus convenience. Those 24 words are more convenient to back up than randomly generated, completely separate private keys every time I want to do a transaction, because now I have to worry about backing up all those private keys or key pairs. So there was a trade-off at one point to say, well, this is the better option from a convenience perspective, but there's no security person in the world that's going to say, well, yes, even if it's negligible, it's slightly less secure than completely random private keys. So I think there's this security versus convenience debate that we talked about last time that, whenever you hear me talk, that's the big thing that I'm pushing for is, there is a point in which security is good enough and it's convenient enough for people to use it. So if security is too high and the convenience is low, people are now going to either not use it, they're going to look for ways to circumvent your security practices, and all the way on the right, if it's too convenient, then the security is horrible and it's going to get hacked and there's going to be less adoption. So there is that middle ground, and it could vary per person, and it could also vary depending on the amount of assets, just as like we have cold wallets and hot wallets. So it might be just a question of risk. Am I holding 50% of my assets in crypto? I might want to do something a little bit different than the average person who is, I'm playing with crypto and I have, maybe 1% of my assets in crypto. And for that 1%, I'll keep it on my phone. Maybe it's not a big deal for me. I'll have $500 on a hardware wallet on my phone. And I know from a security perspective, it's not as, secure as a cold wallet and doing offline signing. So I think it's also just about adapting your security measures or security posture depending on the risk. And I think people are too binary. It's have to do this or you have to do that. No, me myself, I might keep some funds on a hardware wallet sitting on my phone in case I need to, I'm out and I need to do a crypto transaction. I'm not going to run home and start reassembling and doing multi-sig to send out a $50, transaction. So I'll keep $500 on a wallet that's sitting on my phone. And if it gets hacked, it's $500. It's not the end of the world. It's also like somebody putting a gun and stealing the cash out of my wallet. So it's that same risk that you have. I'm not going to walk around with $1 million worth of cash sitting on me, just like I'm not going to walk around with $1 million of cash sitting on my phone. That's going to be in a bank. But I'll walk around with $500 cash on me, just like maybe I'll walk around with $500 in crypto. I think we have to start thinking about it from a risk profile perspective.
Yeah, 100% agree on this. And I think it's also like very important here to diversify your security initiatives. Don't have like maybe in some scenarios, not only one ledger wallet, but maybe two. And I think it's also completely fine to hold at least some coins, for example, also on a centralized exchange. If you are like trading regularly, I think it's also like better to have it like directly on the exchange itself rather than sitting in a cafe with your ledger and putting your passport, your password into it while sitting in the cafe in order to send a couple of $100 to Kraken. I think this is like actually a bigger security gap than leaving like some coins on a trusted again exchange like Kraken, for example. So yeah, there are a lot of things to explore here. And once again, bringing it back to Ledger, you criticize that they didn't just create a new device completely from scratch. What do the news mean for the regular Ledger holder that already has a Ledger wallet? Does something change for these persons, or is this new feature just embedded in the new devices that will be produced in the next weeks?
So now this goes to the open source, closed source debate. So, now you're trusting Ledger. So now they've lost a little bit of trust because they rolled this feature out without telling people. So now the trust is gone. Now, if you trust what they say, that innate in the device, you have to actually click the button in order to generate it, then if what they're saying is true, while not great, you do have that security measure of I have to, actually press the button to generate those seeds, and it can't be done remotely. But people now don't trust them. So now that's why they have to open source so people can see that code. As far as Ledger, it was only rolled out on the Nano X. Me myself, I've never had the Nano X just because of the Bluetooth capability. Just again, as a cybersecurity person, to me, it's not worth that potential, additive attack vector. So, for me, I'm always like a Nano S or a Nano S Plus, and the Nano S does not have the ability to have that firmware, and the Nano S Plus, they have not rolled out that feature. So I'm still recommending Ledger to people, telling them, I would just recommend going with the Nano S Plus. I actually, believe it or not, I just bought a few extra for myself, just in case I don't know what's happening with them, if that feature is going to get rolled out. And just, generally, I don't run to update firmware. That just goes with good security practices as well, is unless this is firmware is being released to address a specific security vulnerability, I don't necessarily run to update just to get a new feature. I'll maybe stay a few versions behind so that way I can see, is there a vulnerability in a new feature? So I think that's just also good cybersecurity practices. Unless you're specifically updating for a feature that you absolutely need, and or you're looking to a security vulnerability, you don't just have to run an update just because it's a new firmware that was pushed out. Again, I still recommend Ledger. Trezor has that side channel attack where somebody gets physical access to that device, they can extract your seeds. Now, again, this goes back to, some stuff I've talked about earlier, is defense in depth. So if somebody has a Ledger Nano X with this feature enabled, guess what? You can still do things securely. How? Offline signing. So your Ledger device is never connected to a machine that's never connected to the internet, so it never has the capability to actually exfiltrate those shards. So you create a transaction on an online machine, bring it over to an offline laptop, plug in your Ledger, sign it, copy that transaction, go back to your other machine, and push it out. So if you've been doing that since the beginning from an offline signing perspective, this is somewhat irrelevant to you as well. And you can go even a step further and do multi-sig. So even if your Ledger and your seeds are compromised, you still have that secondary key that may be sitting on a Trezor. Now, again, security purist, side channel attacks and Bluetooth and radio. But the reality is 99.9% of the population is not having North Korea, Lazarus Group attacking them for their crypto. So all of these things are probably above and beyond what the average person needs to do to protect their crypto. And I think we're creating this fear in the community of no matter what I do, it's not good enough. And I think that's not serving anybody well.
Yeah, I think this is also like a very, very good statement here to also wrap up this interview. So is this also what you would criticize about today's crypto industry, or the narrative that is being pushed, that it's like choosing between the red and the blue pill, and either you're super secure or not secure at all, and that false assumptions are being made, and that people have like crazy security procedures, even though they just need to protect only a couple of $1,000 or just $1,000 and act like they're getting attacked by North Korea tomorrow.
Exactly. Like, am I going to spend $1 million to protect $1,000? Like, the answer is no. It's risk. But you're right. It's this the red pill or blue pill. It's even the most secure solution is hackable, right? Everything is hackable. And I think we have to start with that premise, is there's always going to be vulnerability in something. And it might not be in the technology. It might be in the person. It might be in the process. There's always going to be cybersecurity professional that's going to point out this is the particular vulnerability. No matter what the technology is, it exists. The question is, what does it cost an attacker in order to exploit that? So yes, I might find a vulnerability, but it might cost me $5 million to do this exploit to try to gain something that's worth $1,000. So there's an analysis that's typically done as to what is the likelihood or probability that this is going to be exploited, or how quickly can I discover that particular exploit after the fact? So I think to your point about the red pill blue pill, it's right. It's just some things are just okay and good enough and accepting. And I think we're not doing anybody a service by having, people scream at everybody that nothing's good enough. I like to, use the analogy of water. Is water always finds its weakest point, and an attacker is always going to find its weakest point. It could just be kidnapping and a gun to your head. Like all of your security shit is out the window. If a car rolls up, throws you in the car, points a gun at your head and says, go in your house and grab your crypto, unlock it for me and transfer all your funds. I don't care what you have in the secure element and the HSMs and all of this stuff. The only way to protect against that is like a secondary person that, has the other side. But again, like that stuff's not going to happen. So I think we call it the $5 wrench attack. I could just, beat somebody until they give me their password. So I think we just also have to be a little bit more realistic as to, who's, potentially, after us in some respects.
Yeah, 100%. And I think this also points back to the conversation we had recently. I highly recommend this interview for all of you who haven't seen this. Was one of my favorite episodes, actually, because there were like so many straightforward things that people actually do in order to exploit people, but also projects. We had this conversation about being on a crypto conference, and what I've mentioned, sitting in a cafe, typing in your the password into your ledger. I think this is actually also like very, very insecure to sit in an open space and open your hardware device. This also like creates a huge surface, even though from a hardware perspective, you're pretty safe. So yeah, I think this is a very, very important discussion that we had once again. David, thank you so much. I think I feel way more educated about the open source and the closed source discussion, and also more importantly, what's next when holding a ledger. So I think this was very, very important. And yeah, thank you so much again for shedding some light on all of this and for taking us behind the curtain, what's going on in the security space. And yeah, I hope I see you very, very soon on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.